I don't think we've ever completed the questions.
All right. We can get started. So you guys mentioned completing the questions. I told the group on Tuesday morning that, you know, a lot of you actually enjoy talking about them. And I wish that it wouldn't be a foreign thing to think about inviting someone over to talk through questions about Bible study. And they don't even have to be my questions. I mean, I don't think mine are that great. Most of mine are, I try to write them in a way that makes you think about what it means, and not just like flip back pages and look up answers, because you should be capable of flipping pages. As they would say, you know, when you go to university, that if you're in second or third grade, you look back and you find the answer and you copy it from one spot to another spot, but eventually you have to learn to think why that's the answer. Like, what's going on? Why does this apply? And some of the questions, especially that surround the inclusion of Gentiles in the church, are difficult for us because we're not familiar with the context. You know, none of us are first century Pharisaical Jews. At least I don't think so. No one's raising their hand. So that part is different. We're going to finish chapter 14. I only brought one copy of 14, so if you have it from last week, you can look at it. If you don't, you're up the creek without a paddle. Or maybe you're in the creek. So this is the end of their first mission. They go from, I want to say it's Perga and Attalia, which were these port cities on the Mediterranean, and they go north to Pisidian Antioch, and then to Iconium, and then to Lystra. And Lystra is the place where that priest of Zeus and the people come to offer sacrifice to them, and they get kind of frustrated, and then they leave after they yell at them for a little while. And Paul gets stoned and dragged out of the city. And then the last place they go is Derbe, or Derby. I don't know quite how to say it, but Derbe sounds more fun, and no one from North Dakota says it that way, except for me. So Paul had preached in Derbe, and it talks about them being successful. They make a considerable number of disciples, and they want to plant a local church. Paul and Barnabas seem to know and be operating out of the principle already that they're not going to stay there permanently. They're on a mission. They're eventually going back to Antioch. They return to the same cities on their way back. So they go back through, and that's kind of interesting because, anyone want to venture a guess as to why?
Well, they wanted to see if the churches they built were still going, I would guess. They
wanted to see if they were still going. I think that could be part of it. That thought hadn't even occurred to me. But yeah, I think that would be a good point. I kind of wonder, do they come back and they're like, uh-oh, Paul's here. We better go to church. The grouchy guy is back. He talks a lot. Bring your earplugs. I don't know. But what else would be kind of what had happened on their journey?
They had opposition.
They had opposition, and not just opposition, but these people really weren't friendly, and they had basically chased them out of town. And not only did they chase them out of one town, but they followed them around and tried to get to the synagogues in other towns to tell them to throw out Paul and Barnabas. And in Lystra, he ends up getting stoned. Now, I don't know about you, but if you got stoned at a place, would you think, I'm going to stop there and visit on my way back? How many of you go on a car trip, and if you stay at a horrible hotel where the service is awful and everything goes wrong, and you get a monster bill, are like, this would be a good place to come back and visit? You might say it wasn't that bad, but he actually got stoned and they thought he was dead. And they drug him out of town. That's pretty dead. But it seems like maybe on their way back, instead of preaching publicly, they do more preaching privately. That they're not engaging in the same kind of public debate. You could say the first round was to sow the seed more widely. The second round is to sort of come back and weed the garden. And if the plants aren't growing there, you don't weed there because there's nothing growing there to keep anyway.
Well, that would show courage to those that wanted to believe, and if they're like, wow, this guy's coming back after the treatment he received, then
it would be a show of courage. You see, none of these things are in my notes. Look at how many things we have to add. It's like no wonder we're on page 101. I didn't think when I started this that I was going to write a book almost as long as the one you're reading. Paul exhorts the disciples to persevere, that we undergo many trials. And I think this is so important to remember because it's the opposite of the world we live in. It's the opposite of the culture we live in. That the kingdom of heaven is found at great cost and great price. That it's not the lazy river that floats to heaven. It's not do nothing and you will arrive at the great gates. It's more like pack everything you can on your shoulders and it still won't be enough and you have no hope of success. But God is calling you, so go. And somehow He provides for what you need along the way. Paul emphasizes the importance of following up. It's not just the preaching of the gospel. And sometimes this can happen as we think more about evangelization. Like it's not enough to invite people to Mass once or invite them to practice their faith once. Because if you're a new Catholic, or you're not even Catholic yet, and you come to a Catholic church, it's kind of big and scary, and you need someone to hold your hand because there's all these responses and all these prayers, and you don't know what it is, and then there's communion, and there's all these other things. And so a huge piece of evangelization and proclaiming the gospel isn't just sharing the message the first time, but you have to decide to be friends longer term. You have to decide to reach out and to continue to do the work. They establish presbyters in each church. Now again, this is interesting. This is something that seems very intentional on their part. If it says they establish presbyters, what would be the more familiar language we would use now?
Elders.
Elders, you're close. Priests, and what did he do with priests? He didn't just establish them and say, you're a priest. He did that too. He commissioned them. He ordained them. He actually laid hands on them to ordain them to the presbyterate, to become elders for the local churches. And again, this is something that I think speaks highly of Paul, is he sees himself in his role as an apostle as establishing a church. And very, very quickly, he doesn't just create a local community that prays together, but he actually ordains people to lead the local community. There's a structure already at the very beginning that you're starting to see. Now, it's not the whole structure that emerges over time, where you have parishes, and each parish is led by a priest, and priests are related to a diocese and a bishop. In the time of Paul, there's churches that had many presbyters. There was like a council of elders. There was a group. This should seem a bit strange to us because some of them could have been relatively new believers. I mean, unless you imagine Paul traveling with a large group of people, which I suppose is possible, but I guess even reading this, I didn't feel like he brought along too many more people than Barnabas. But I suppose he could have. It would make sense, like a scribe to write letters and record things, and so Some of them could have been from the local Jewish community, people that already had biblical knowledge. I mean, think of how hard it would be. Like, you're in one of these churches and Paul comes and he preaches and he's there for maybe a month or two and Barnabas is there and they're teaching you. Would you be ready after a month or two for like, yeah, see you later. You know, we ordained that guy. He's going to lead your local church now. We'll be back. I mean, this is like, they're climbing with weights on their back. It's not just up the mountain. It's like up the mountain lugging cannonballs. Through prayer and fasting, he commends them to the Lord, and then they return to the coast and they sail to Antioch. This is Syrian Antioch. So they go back to Pisidian Antioch. Pisidia is that region on the Anatolian plateau, 100 miles north of the coast. And he leaves from there and sails back to Syrian Antioch because they want us to be confused. So they all named their towns the same. And when they're in Antioch, they tell the story of their adventures. And this, I think, speaks to something critical. It's important that we share our stories. It's important that we share examples of where we see God at work, where people have encountered conversion and grace. There's power to a story, and we live in a culture that, by and large, operates without a story. I mean, I think one of the things that we've lost that's really precious is the role of a storyteller. Even the Native Americans had this in their community, and very often the old men and women that were no longer able to work would tell stories to the young kids. Stories can have a moral, they can have a place. I know a couple weeks ago, Father Ross and I both spoke about sharing a testimony, telling part of your story, and a piece of that is that there's a lesson to it. There's a reason why. You know, sometimes you don't share your whole story, but you can give people a reason why. Sometimes, you know, like with your kids, you might say, well, look, this choice looks okay. When I was your age, this is what I did. It didn't work out that well. Or these were the consequences. Or this is what my friends did, you know, and they ended up in, like, you can... We have to, I think, rediscover the art of storytelling. And this is something that I have to admit very much I'm bad at as a priest, because so often, like on Sundays, we preach a homily and people kind of remember homilies. But there's stories that you probably remember that you heard for the first time when you were like 3. You've heard lots of words since then. But story, you know, and little songs, Mary Had a Little Lamb, and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. You probably learned some of those for the first time when you know, barely could walk. And most of you could still recite Mary Had a Little Lamb from memory, even though it could have been a decade since you've actually seen it in print, or 2 decades or more. There's a power to story. And sometimes I wonder if our purposes in homilies, for instance, would be far better accomplished if we told it as a story with characters that you would remember and associate with things, rather than just sort of straight theology, or like we often do, like speaking directly, because there's a power to stories. I mean, if you think about the life of Jesus that's recorded in the gospel, most of it is actually miracle stories. And lots of the Gospels are a series of miracle stories, and then a long speech by Jesus, and then a series of stories, and another long speech. But an entire Gospel, except for the Gospel of John, there's sometimes only a handful of longer passages where you actually have the words of Jesus. Much of it is actually just things that Jesus did, because they were memorable. People saw it. People could relate to it. So I think, you know, kind of working on that role of storyteller is important. And if you think of it, like for instance, one of the things, this is going to look awkward on the video, but I wanted my water. And one of the things, for instance, is what kind of cultural stories do we have now? I mean, you could maybe pick a few things, but would they be very good examples that would teach a moral lesson? Like Harry Potter. It's not a bad book, but it's hard to distill out some good moral lessons from it other than the good of friendship. You could think of something like HBO's The Game of Thrones. That's hugely popular, one of the most widely watched television shows of who knows how long. I'm not sure what story you would get out of that except life is miserable and hard and people fight with each other. You know, there's football games and our sort of national pastime in sports, but
C.S. Lewis has some. Yeah.
C.S. Lewis has some great stories, but you could argue that some of those aren't as widely known. I mean, maybe Lord of the Rings would fit as a widely known kind of cultural story. Don't watch Amazon's Rings of Power. It's not very good. You're better off for it. Some things I would recommend, some things I would unrecommend. So we get to chapter 15, and we have the story of the council in Jerusalem. This is one of the critical events in the book of Acts. And it should strike us as a little bit strange, because at the council in Jerusalem, they're going to debate the question of the inclusion of the Gentiles in the church, and what that means and what rules they have to follow. But what have we talked about already in our Bible study?
Well, the church is universal. It doesn't matter.
The church is universal, and that theme comes about when Peter goes to meet Cornelius, right? I mean, at least in your mind, didn't that kind of settle the question? Like, Peter had this dream, he interprets the dream about the inclusion of the Gentiles, and then he goes and he finds Cornelius and his family, and he preaches, they receive the Holy Spirit, and they're baptized. Like, at least in my mind, like, okay, God spoke, he solved the problem. But there's a debate. And the debate reaches a bit of a fever pitch. Where is the debate happening mostly? Be brave.
Jerusalem.
In Jerusalem. No, it doesn't seem like it. Guess again. Where are Paul and Barnabas? In Antioch. Syrian Antioch. And that was one of the places where we talked about earlier, there was this challenge of the Hellenistic Jews, like the Greek speakers who had converted to Judaism, and they're a little bit intense about their Jewish fervor, and that's where Paul preaches, and he sort of gets kicked out of the city at night and flees to the coast and then sails away, because he and Barnabas, you know, there's a whole history in Antioch. And now Paul and Barnabas are back, and they're talking about their success among the Gentiles, and how many Gentiles are receiving the gift of grace, how many Gentiles are becoming part of the church. And in the book of Acts, what would you expect the people to feel?
Anger.
Not anger. Jealousy. Jealousy is the one that has come about so often in the book of Acts. But there seems to be this tension in the church, and they're not listening to Paul and Barnabas. We know they're not listening because what eventually happens? They send Paul and Barnabas to Jerusalem to ask the other apostles. And you wouldn't do that if you listened to Paul and Barnabas. Paul probably wanted to go himself because he's like, God has solved this question already, and I'm going to tell them so. But they send Paul and Barnabas and some other representatives. They appeal to the authority of the apostles. Now again, this I think is so important for the way that we understand the church, because already in the book of Acts, there's an appeal to authority. Someone has authority to decide questions. In this case, the authority lies with a council of the apostles in Jerusalem. These men who are established as witnesses, who have this office of apostleship, witnesses to the resurrection. So questions are being asked. We need someone who can speak on issues, who can solve the problem, because it's not actually all that clear. Jesus doesn't say directly which Jewish practices you must follow and which Jewish practices you shouldn't follow. Now, as Christians, there's a whole set of Jewish practices that we think are absolutely essential, that we don't get rid of. Those lie in the realm of be brave.
Well, certain, the liturgy, there's certain things that we...
The liturgy. What's the heart of the Jewish liturgy? Come on, you guys, you have like 6 people at your table. What's the heart of the Jewish liturgy? They offer sacrifices in the temple. Does that stuff still apply to us? No.
Well, there is such a sacrifice.
We believe that the sacrifice of Jesus was offered once for all. There's no longer a sacrificial system. But there is a set of Jewish precepts that we actually keep to very, very closely. You learned them as a kid. You did. The 10 Commandments, Jewish moral law. Christianity doesn't reject Jewish moral law. Jewish ceremonial law, Jewish ritual law, yes, but Jewish moral law very much has been kept and actually intensified even. The idea of Jesus, the ideal of Jesus is much stronger than the commandments of the Old Testament. We talk about the intensification in the book of Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount. I think you've heard it said, you shall not kill, but I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother. So, I actually live in the midst of this debate, because what we don't often realize in the modern church is there's pieces of Judaism that we actually have kept and have fully sort of accommodated or form a baseline for Christianity. And then there's pieces of Judaism that are very, very different that we don't follow, like Jewish rules about food, and you can't eat meat and dairy and boiling a kid in its mother's milk, and the specific prescriptions of all of the sacrifices, and that they can only be offered in one place at the temple in Jerusalem. We don't follow that part of Jewish law. And a huge reason why is this council in Jerusalem that is sorting through the questions. And you don't feel it all, but the primary question of the early church is, where does salvation lie? Where does salvation come from? In Christianity, salvation comes from Jesus, who dies on the cross and offers himself for us. And we receive that gift of salvation through, don't say good works. We receive it through grace. It's a gift. We do receive it at baptism. We receive it as we believe, but it's received through faith. That's the language of the New Testament. Now, it's for the sake of good works. It needs to be effective. It needs to be manifest and visible. But the primary emphasis, first and foremost, is that it's received by grace, through faith. That it's a gift of God. And so that's the sacrifice of Jesus. Where would the early Jews say they find salvation? We just talked about it a second ago. The sacrifices in the temple. Circumcision is a good example, but as long as you mean by circumcision living the whole Jewish life, which I think which our author points out, it seems to be what is meant by, are you going to circumcise these new Christians who are Gentiles? So the opposition is between Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus, and the works of the law. faith in Jesus or works. And that's where a huge piece of the division in the New Testament lies. It's not really talking about the works of Christians. It's talking about the works of the Jewish law. Are you saved because you offered the sacrifice of turtle doves, like Mary and Joseph did in the temple for Jesus? Does that bring them salvation? In one sense, yes, because they're being obedient to the law of God, but in another sense, no, because the blood of an animal has no ability to take away sin. That it's the blood of Jesus, who is already God, that is capable of taking away sin. That's what's required. So this is the debate. Where does salvation lie? And that's actually the way that it shows. That's what's at stake in the question that they're asking, that Paul and Barnabas are asking in Jerusalem, that the church in Antioch wants to know. Where does salvation lie? Because Paul will claim later in his letters that if you believe in circumcision, you're bound to keep the entirety of the Jewish law. And can anyone do that? No. The only one that actually kept Jewish law was Jesus himself. And so if you say that you're going to circumcise yourself because you find salvation in that, you're binding yourself to a promise that you cannot keep. That's why Paul gets so upset about it. Because if Jesus is the only one who can keep it, if he's the only one who is sinless, and then Mary we sort of add in because of the sacrifice of Jesus and his grace, but if he's the only one that can keep it, then you binding yourself to a law that you cannot keep is a recipe for disaster. Be like your kids telling you, Mom, I am so thankful that you are around that I'm going to pay you $1 million by the time I'm 18. It would be a very bad promise for them to make, right? Because it's impossible for them to keep. At least for most of them. Some of you might be in your bedroom one night and your kid is like, I invented something. Our basement is gone, but I invented something. It's worth $1 million. What did you do? Where is my basement? In our disagreements with people, I think one of the things that is really important to work at, and we have to strive for this is important for marriage and lots of other places, is to work so that it's not an oppositional system, like either I win or you win. That it's me against you, and one of us is going to win and one of us is going to lose. Because the only option there is that someone's going to lose. But a better perspective, what happens in the book of Acts, is seeking the truth together. That you might be coming from things in different perspectives. There's times where we have very different opinions and ideas. But it's a good way to frame it if you can see it as, let's stand next to each other and work toward the truth, which might mean that both of us have to give up on our positions. That actually happens in the book of Acts. They eventually compromise. They don't take all of Jewish law and they don't reject everything. They sort of do something in the middle to accommodate some of the Jewish sensibilities while still putting the emphasis on the sacrifice of Jesus. But this happens so often in relationships that I think it's worth pointing out that we get oppositional. In modern parlance, it's called a zero-sum game. That there's no way for everyone to come out ahead, that someone always has to lose. It's a zero-sum game. And what you want to do is to have a game where you don't have to lose, where you can work together. And so you can even see this, like there's a modern board game called Pandemic. It's kind of creepy in light of COVID because it's kind of it's about disease and how they spread. But one of the cool parts is you actually play it as a team, and you either win against the game or the game wins. But you win or lose together. And so it fosters a much greater spirit of camaraderie because it's not like either your son is going to win or your daughter's going to win, and whoever doesn't win is going to be upset. In this case, you either all win or you all lose. So in the Council of Jerusalem, Paul and Barnabas return from their journey. There's conflict with Christians from Judea. They say that you must be circumcised according to the Mosaic covenant to be saved. This is an earlier commandment of God himself, and I think he says to keep it forever. So it's a real question. Like, if God said to keep it forever, who are you to say no? But it was seen, and Paul points to this right away, it's not just about being circumcised, that it was about taking on yourself the responsibility of keeping the whole law. It was what made you a part of the covenant people of God. Now, in Jesus, how are we made part of the covenant people of God? Shirley, this is your chance.
Which is to be part.
Oh, what did I say? Oh, baptism.
That we become part of the covenant people of God through baptism. And so what Paul is arguing is that has replaced circumcision, because once you are baptized, you are part of the covenant people of God. You don't need to become part of the covenant people of God in another way. You're part of it already. You're baptized. We're baptized into Christ. But it doesn't work, so the contentions arise, and they appeal to the apostles. So they go to the apostles and elders of the church in Jerusalem. This is that word presbyters. So there's presbyters in Jerusalem already. There's elders. They are sent on a journey by the church in Antioch. And now this is one of the funny parts of Paul. So he's sent to go ask the apostles in Jerusalem this question and come back and report. And what does he do? You guys don't even read my notes like the kids would. He talks to the people along the way. So he doesn't just go to Jerusalem. He's like the, marching band that's practicing as he marches down the road, like, look what we did, look how many Gentiles embrace the gospel, isn't it so exciting? And the people say, yes, and they rejoice. Be like, Paul, this isn't the agreement. You're supposed to ask the question, not proclaim the answer. He was politicking. So they respond with joy. They're welcomed by the apostles in Jerusalem, and they tell the story of their journey and Gentile conversions. And then some Pharisees come along who had become believers, and this is something that I think we have to take seriously. And this is one of the things that I struggle with, because you'll meet people who say things like this, and it's just bananas to me. Like, well, I grew up Lutheran and I became Catholic when I married my wife, and so I don't know these things. It's like, you're in your 70s. You have been Catholic for 50 years. Arguably, you've been Catholic for longer than you were Lutheran.